Hello, my name is Brian Lenskis. I'm an internal medicine doc here in San Diego, California, and I'm highly honored to be here at the Low Carb All Stars. Dr. Paul Mason, thank you so much for inviting me. I thought you might have made a mistake, so I figured I'd get this talk done as quickly as I could before you change your mind. So everyone, thank you for joining me. Hopefully this will be of some interest to you. I really want to talk about the clinical aspects of low carb and how we apply that in the clinic here. So my talk is called One Size Fits One, because ultimately that's what it comes down to, what works for you or that patient in front of you, if you're a physician or a healthcare practitioner. So disclosures, I have no financial interest in the pharmaceutical industry. That will become very apparent. I've been practicing almost 19 years now here in San Diego. I'm using a low carb, keto, intermittent fasting approach to my patients clinically for the last 3 years, going on 4 now. And this is my dietary bias. I'm co-host of the Low Carb MD podcast with Jason Fung and Tro Kalayjian, and also founder of Low Carb MD San Diego, which is a direct primary care focusing on metabolic health. I'm also the host of Life's Best Medicine podcast, talking about all the other things that matter that we're going to talk about a bit today. Life's Best Medicine podcast is sponsored by Simply Snacking. They are helping the production costs. I am not taking a profit from that. Also, I'm unpaid board of directors for KetoKine nutritional drink. So patients often ask me, Doc, what's the best path to take for better health? And my answer is generally, it depends. It depends where you want to go and how long your journey is going to be. So this is the problem we run into. People say, well, my friend did it this way, and my other friend did it that way, and my aunt did it this way. So really trying to find the right path for you. It doesn't matter what everyone else does. It's really figuring out the best path forward for you. So some of us are the hare and some of us are the tortoise, where we just plod along and do it. And I've seen people have success both ways. Sometimes the rabbit, as we know, will take off quickly and then burn out, but the tortoise just keeps plugging along. So, hopefully 4 steps forward and 1 step back as we go on this journey. So these are questions that come up daily in clinic. What is more important, diet or exercise? Should I weigh myself every day? How many cheat meals do I get a week? How much alcohol can I drink? Do I need to fast? Are artificial sweeteners okay? Should I eat more protein or more fat? How strict should I be on my carb intake? The answer is it depends. It depends where you're starting out. If you're really sick, if you're diabetic, or whether you're someone trying to maintain your health. So unfortunately, that's my answer a lot of the times, is it really does depend on the individual. And that's what we're coming back to more and more. So Dr. Ben Bikman is one of my favorite people on earth. And I happened to talk to him back at Low Carb Denver. And I said, Ben, look, as a physician, if I want to live a long, healthy life, what do I have to do? And he says, okay, Brian, 5 things, very easy. Number 1, watch your stress level. Don't work 14-hour days and run around like you're crazy all day. And at that time, I was in a standard practice, working 14-hour days, running around like crazy all the time. And he said, make sure you get enough sleep. Well, back then, I was working downtown, so I'd have to ride 45 minutes each way with no traffic. And so that wasn't working out. That, oh no, he only has 5 criteria and I'm 0 for 2. He said, next, don't smoke or drink to excess. Next, exercise regularly. Next, watch your diet. And he goes, that's it. What do you want to talk about now? So 5 things. And this is the other stuff I want to talk about. Not just the diet, but everything else that goes with it. Ben Bikman says, keep your visceral fat as low as possible for longevity, and all these things lower visceral fat and insulin levels. Dr. Ben Bikikio, who's the workout guy, says, okay, muscle mass is the most important thing. So I was thinking, who's right? Which of these guys is right? Well, it turns out they're both right, because the more muscle mass you have, the better off you do at keeping your insulin low and decreasing visceral fat. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the slides. Also, as a physician, I say, okay, is it about weight loss? So this is a slide that Ivor Cummins loaned me. And basically, I talk about this in every talk I give, because these are people in the country of Colombia, and they were looking at heart attack risk. And they said, okay, let's look at people who had heart attacks and who didn't. And we're going to review the labs and see what we could have done to predict this was coming. So total cholesterol, if it's a risk ratio of 1, means there was no difference between the 2 groups. High total cholesterol and high LDL made no difference between the 2 groups. Yet that's what we talk about all the time. High blood pressure doubled the risk of heart attack. And as Dr. Unwin and many others will say, high blood pressure is clinically correlated with high insulin levels about 90% of the time. High insulin level is almost a 700% increase. I have to move myself out of the way here. Hopefully you can see the top there, 6.7 times. So why don't we talk about this? Well, because this is what Ben Bikman's talking about, and this takes time. It's not very, these we could throw drugs at very easily, but this one, we really have to look at those 5 things that Dr. Bikman was talking about. So this is another one. I just wanted to throw this in there to give you an idea, because a lot of people say, well, low carb is not good because it raises cholesterol. But look at this back row. So if we're going from back to front here, this is HDL, low HDL versus high HDL. So we can see our risk of heart attack goes up and up and up as our HDL is lower. Guess what? Low carb and lifestyle changes raises HDL. So I'd rather be here in the front row with an LDL of 220 with an HDL of 85 than in the back row with a good LDL cholesterol. So this slide just brings a point that we really have to look at the whole picture and really monitor these laboratories closely. This is A1C adjusted for against cardiac risk. And as we can see, as the 3-month sugar average goes higher, the risk of cardiac complications goes up. So we're told that a 3-month sugar average of 7 in the US terms is good. Well, that's a 400% increased risk of cardiovascular disease. I think most people would rather be here on this end. So this is another slide by Ben Bikman. And this is one I use daily in my clinic, because this bottom line, the sugar and the 3-month sugar average, we could, if we're just tracking this, we're going to miss the rising insulin. So insulin, the higher this gets, it's a sign of worsening metabolic disease. So if we're up here, we're in trouble. We're on the border of diabetes. The good news is this is a 10-year process. So if we catch this elevated insulin every year going up and watching it, and watching stress and watching dietary changes and exercise, we can really make an impact before the patient, any of us, are diagnosed with diabetes. And this is why this N of 1, the person in front of us, is very important, because it depends where they are on this curve of how strict we have to be at decreasing that insulin level. Because if someone's on the verge of diabetes, we have to be a lot more strict, or if they're diabetic, we have to be a lot more strict than someone who's just down here trying to maintain health. And this is type 2 diabetes here at the end. So insulin resistance, this is from Ben Bikman. I guess he doesn't have to give a talk. I'm giving all of his lectures. So anyways, these are all the diseases we see. And as a primary care physician, this is what matters to me. I don't want to treat all of these with individual drugs. I want to attack the root cause of insulin resistance, lowering insulin, lifestyle. So can you spot the elephant in the room? I'll make it it's a little bit tough. Here he is down here, but here's the big elephant in the room. Stress. This is what I see as the biggest factor for people not succeeding or having trouble changing lifestyle: stress, lack of family support, and stress. Because we kind of revert back to our old ways. When we get stressed out, we want to eat more, and that's our way of dealing with stress and discomfort and just trying to make ourselves feel better. But in the end, we feel more like an elephant in the room. So this is what I use. This is called a SICA, and this is a scale that gives us body composition. So I can look at visceral fat, subcutaneous fat, muscle mass, bone density with this machine, but it's not necessary. We could do the same thing with the string, because the biggest indicator of metabolic disease is waist circumference. So we follow this closely. And as we'll talk about later, sometimes these inches will change way before the weight changes. And this is a huge topic. This is why I'm speaking about this today, because I think a lot of people give up, even though they're improving metabolically, they're improving clinically. The scale becomes such a focus that it really causes us problems. This, I think, is the most valuable tool we have. It's a continuous glucose monitor. We use it as a lie detector test, because if people say they're not eating carbs and we're seeing it spike like crazy, generally we can ask a few questions to ascertain what's happening. But more importantly, it's for the patient. When they see their sugar spike with eating corn or eating fruit, then it's not my opinion anymore. They can see it themselves. So a lot of people self-regulate quickly because they realize that creamer they have in their coffee is causing a problem, and they can make those changes quickly. And so this is a patient of mine, just as an example, came in with very poorly controlled diabetes despite being on multiple medications. And his sugars in the 260, 240 range up here. So this is on October 1st. When we jump ahead, October 28th, and the same patient, his sugars are 70s, 80s, 90s, even in the 60s. When he finger stuck his sugars, they were actually in the normal range. So, but he called me on this and said, oh my goodness, my sugars keep dropping. But he was actually running in the mid 60s at that point. But that's a lot better in the 260s. And here, this spike we see was from exercise because he's fat adapted. His body can release sugar to burn as fuel. So this is a great sign that we're looking for in people who are fat adapted. This one you can see flat, perfect. This is what we want to see. And then here, what happened around 4:00 p.m. on Sunday, happy hour, right? When Margarita did it. So these kind of things, and they called me and said, "Oh my goodness, did you see what happened yesterday?" So this is fun because we could see this happening. Here's another one, patient doing great. You can see before and after. This is the important thing, is after they were doing great the next day. 1/2 of a cupcake spiked her like this, over 190 or so, because she had passed up these cupcakes 4 times that day, and then someone upset her at work, and she said, forget it, just went back to old habits, grabbed a cupcake, and there she went. But that was her last cupcake, by the way. So this one, you say, well, what happened here, doctor? Exercise. Went for a long bike ride. Here you go. Exercise down here. So this is why the continuous glucose monitor is so important, because certain things are going to change the sugars. It's not always bad, because sometimes exercise will do it. What else can do it? Stress. This guy had to give a presentation in front of his board, and his CFO and CEO were both there, and it stressed him out. So his sugar spiked. He said, I didn't even eat anything with carbs, and look what happened. So these are important factors to look at. And these are those things Dr. Bickman was talking about also: exercise, watching the stress level. So when people say, is it a bad thing for sugars to spike? I'll say, it just depends. If it's spiking because you're exercising, then no, it's not a bad thing. Or stress, if you try to minimize the stress, it's good for you to see that. But lack of sleep will raise the sugars also. It's not just what you're eating. So it's all about the scale, right? I'm telling you, in clinic, we always focus on the scale. We don't, but in general, that's what people are looking at for their success marker. But metabolic health is our goal. We have to remember that. I think that is a key. That's a key take home, I think, in this lecture. Visceral fat is linked to multiple comorbidities. That's the fat around the organs. There's subcutaneous fat, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, is the love handles and the stuff we want to get, the jiggly stuff we want to get rid of, but that's not actually killing us. It's the visceral fat. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move along here. But visceral fat associated with multiple cancers: colon, breast, endometrium, esophageal, and kidney cancer, stroke, coronary disease, dementia, early death, diabetes, and hypertension. So visceral fat is really our enemy. It's not necessarily the weight. Because if you're Sean Baker and you put on a ton of muscle mass, does that mean you're unhealthy because you weigh more? No, absolutely not. It's really looking at the visceral fat ratios and muscle mass. So this is my patient, Sue. I'm just putting her in here because she's one of my favorite people on earth, but also because she's made some serious life changes. This is at the end of our 16-week program. She went from 256 pounds, eating a low-fat diet, by the way, as a nurse, to a low-carb ketogenic type diet. 58 pounds down, 11 inches off her waist. As we talked about, that is a huge factor. Triglycerides dropped 249 points, from 314 to 65. No drug that I know of is going to do that. HDL went up, just like that slide I was talking about, that the higher your HDL, the better. She went from a mid-range HDL to a very high HDL. I feel really good about that, especially in light of her LDL dropping from 193 to 134, 59-point drop. Visceral fat dropped in half, and this correlates with what we're seeing clinically. Her husband didn't want to be outdone. He basically had the same numbers as her, not quite as impressive as his wife, but after the 16-week mark, he started working out really hard, and he's put on a ton of muscle mass, and he's an absolutely different person, doing amazingly well. So this is another patient of mine, and this is where I say it's not about the weight. So this guy came to me. He had already lost 50 pounds doing a liquid diet. And so the interesting thing is, as his weight dropped, he came to me around this point, and his weight loss slowed dramatically. But his waist circumference dropped significantly, and he put on a ton of muscle mass. So when you look at him, he's wearing pants from when he was like 40 pounds lighter with just a minimal weight loss. So it's not just about the weight loss. It really is about metabolic health. This is another one of my patients came in, morbidly obese, severe diabetes, really in bad shape. Now, here she is making some changes. Now she's happy. They're happy-faced people now. So that's kind of nice to see. This is what we see in clinic. This is what makes us happy and cures burnout for physicians, when you see people coming in like this, knowing that they're doing better, they're feeling better, they're coming off meds, and they have hope again. And that's a critical thing. So it's all about the scale, right? Well, who do you think can hibernate longer? the bear who's designed to hibernate or the lion? The reason I bring this up is this is me and my wife, right? Of course, this is me and this is my wife. I'm insulin resistant. She's insulin sensitive. So what we would do, just like everyone else before I went low carb, during the holidays, we gain weight and say, okay, that's it. January 1st, we'll go on a diet. Well, we would eat the same thing. She would make me breakfast and her breakfast, my lunch, her lunch, my snack, her snack. We had the same thing, same 6 meals a day, like they told us to do. And I'm hardly losing any weight, and she's dropping weight like crazy. Everywhere we go, everyone notices, oh my gosh, you look great, you're losing weight. So I'm thinking, what in the world? I'm twice her size. I should be losing weight a lot quicker. So then I started thinking about bears. Why do bears hold on to their weight, right? What's the advantage? Well, if you think about it, the visceral fat is more like oak. It's harder to burn. So those of us who are far along, it takes longer to get rid of that visceral fat till we could start burning subcutaneous fat, which is more like kindling. So people with a lot of visceral fat, I'm finding, take longer to lose weight in the long term. Initially, they're going to lose water weight when they drop their insulin level down. That's a given. So when you hear about someone losing 30 pounds or something really quickly, is generally going to be water weight, sodium at the beginning, because dropping that insulin again, insulin makes you hold on to sodium in your kidneys, raises blood pressure, right? Raises weight. So as you drop your insulin level down, your salt levels drop and blood pressure generally gets better also. So subcutaneous fat is our unpopular friend. It's the first line of defense against excess energy. So free fatty acids, triglycerides will store there. So if you have a lot of empty visceral fat or subcutaneous fat, you're going to store triglycerides there, and your blood triglycerides are going to be lower. If you can think of it as storage units, and as those storage units are empty, you have plenty of place to put this garbage that you're filling up on. Approximately 80% of our body fat storage is in subcutaneous fat, and subcutaneous adipose tissue is negatively correlated with atherosclerosis, metabolic disease factors, and selective reduction by liposuction does not improve cardiovascular risk. So if we go and take off 20 pounds of subcutaneous fat, liposuction, guess what? It doesn't improve our survival. It may make us look a little bit better until we get a little disfigured, but other than that, it doesn't have a huge effect on our health if that's our ultimate goal. So as we age, subcutaneous fat becomes dysfunctional, right? And the sex hormones like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone force the extra energy to the subcutaneous fat. When we lose that effect or the ability to store fat, now it's starting to go to our visceral fat, which is why as we age, we get more increased risk of cardiovascular disease, increased cardiac inflammatory markers, more insulin resistance, and more inflamed. So you can think about it this way. This is how I kind of conceptualize it. Okay, if I have a power plant, and my power plant's making extra energy, or I'm bringing extra energy into the system by eating too much, my body's going to store it in the best place it can. Well, if this is considered waste and toxic to the body, I'm going to store it over here in these iron drums because they're a better storage form. If I fill up all my iron drums, I'm kind of forced to put it in here in the visceral fat. So once these fill up, I start putting it over here, which is a worse storage place. And that's where we can kind of get into trouble. So what happens as we age, these start rusting and they're not as good at storing energy. So in females, especially, what happens, the bigger hips, the breast tissue, the thighs, once we start being unable to store that appropriately, we shift it over here into visceral fat. So this is the problem. And this is the good news and the bad news. The good news is whenever we start losing weight, we lose the visceral fat first, and then we switch over to the subcutaneous fat. So as we get older, this is why muscle mass, exercise, activity become critical, even if the weight goes up, right? So compared to subcutaneous fat, visceral adipose tissue is mainly in the mesentery, around the organs, around the gut, and drains directly to the liver. That's why we see elevated liver function tests and liver abnormalities. Stress hormones, this is why stress is a huge one, right? More stress and androgen receptors in the visceral fat. So that will suck in the extra energy, and then we get fatter and we get the big belly picture rather than the big bottom picture. So more sensitive to lipolysis initially, but once it gets too big, once you fill up those fat cells really full, they get dysfunctional. So it's hard to break them down. It's hard to get that fat out of there. And that's what we find. That's why the longer we wait, the harder it gets. Markedly increased prediction of mortality if you have more visceral adipose tissue, as we discussed, increases it with age in both sexes. Markedly elevated CRP, which is associated with cardiovascular disease. So visceral fats are really our hidden enemy. They're out to get us, but you don't see them. So you don't, the jiggly stuff is what we really want to get rid of. So as endocrine, paracrine function, there's a lot that visceral adipose does that's different than subcutaneous. After 17 or 18 years of practice, I never knew there was a difference. I thought fat was fat, but now we're starting to see all these different, and this research has been around, by the way, but most primary care docs don't know about it. Pro-inflammatory, this is what we're talking, Dr. David Diamond, other people are talking about increased risk of inflammation, increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Tumor necrosis, alpha and interleukin-6 both can contribute. But we'll talk a little bit more about interleukin-6, which is an interesting hormone. Also takes up glucose faster with insulin stimulation. So visceral adipose tissue is sucking up that extra sugar you're eating. So people with less visceral adipose tissue aren't soaking as much sugar, and they're sending most of that to their muscles. So that's why they can stay thin and we can't. I know it's not fair, but visceral adipose tissue increases risk of all these things: diabetes, elevates triglycerides, lowers HDL, all these things that we're talking about with metabolic syndrome. Increased blood pressure and salt retention, as we discussed, correlates closely with atherosclerosis, heart disease, all these things. So this is all visceral fat. So only obese individuals with increased visceral adipose tissue show complications predictive of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So obese people with normal visceral fat have a lower risk than people. You can have someone who's thin. This is what we call the TOFI. They look good, but then you look at their numbers and think, these are crazy numbers. And this is part of the reason. Again, both sexes, if we control for visceral adipose tissue, that is what explains our increased cardiovascular risk with age. And again, subcutaneous appears to be protective. All forms of weight loss, as we discussed, visceral adipose tissue is affected more than subcutaneous, and it appears that low carb does that even better. So this is one that was interesting in my research here, is TRPBR2 is elevated in visceral adipose tissue, but not subcutaneous adipose tissue. And it blocks and prevents normal lipolysis. This is probably one of the reasons why it's harder to break down big, full fat cells than those that are empty. So this leads to dysfunctional fat storage. Absence of TRPBR2 blocks cytokine storm. And now cytokine storm is what kills people with COVID-19. So this is why this is important stuff: decreasing visceral adipose tissue, decreasing inflammation. That's an inflammatory process that's killing people. So in rats or mice where they block this, no cytokine storm. So that's a huge deal of what we're talking about with metabolic health. So this is the deal. Going back to my wife. My wife had this much visceral adipose tissue. This is me, right? So I have to burn through all this before I can get to her level. So that's why it's easier for her to lose weight. So you can think about muscle as this. It could be a little tiny match, or it could be a flamethrower, right? So there's bad combinations that we can have. You look at this guy, like he has this cool shirt, but this doesn't increase his risk. He might look better going out at night, but he's still at major risk. So I see this guy, it makes me very nervous. Why? Very skinny arms and legs, big belly. That's all visceral fat. So he's preferentially, he might be drinking beers. He might be doing stuff that preferentially causes visceral adipose tissue. So his combination, his muscle mass is like a flame. I mean, a little match. And his visceral adipose is that. That's brutal, because that's going to be hard to melt. He's going to have to really do some work, put on some muscle mass, cut back on the alcohol, maybe, watch the caloric intake and carbohydrates. So this guy, some of you may know, Shawn Baker, here's his combination. That's his visceral adipose tissue. That's his muscle mass. So you look and you go, okay, Shawn's in pretty good shape. So you could debate meat all you want. And I think what is going to come down to is visceral adipose tissue versus muscle mass. So Shawn's in pretty good shape. And because he's so big, I always say he's in good shape. So no matter what, I don't want to get beat up by Shawn. So this is a study by Sean O'Meara. This is a MRI. You can imagine it's a cross section of the abdomen. Looking at, you're looking, like the lady cut in half with a saw, and you're looking up into the abdominal cavity. So this shows at week 0 to week 35, you can see the pink visceral adipose tissue, tons of it. And as this person progresses, very little. So this person is way metabolically healthier. But what's interesting is, as you lose the subcutaneous fat, slowly, you're losing visceral adipose tissue at a higher rate. So visceral adipose tissue was going before the subcutaneous, the love handles were going away. This is another one. This is a big person. You can see big muscle mass, very little visceral adipose tissue. There's a very thin person with no muscle mass, tons of visceral adipose tissue. So you can tell me who's at higher cardiovascular risk looking at this study, even though most people would look at this guy and say he's at worse shape. So people always ask me, which is a more important, diet or exercise? Getting back to the questions I posed initially. Well, if you ever fly, you say, well, which is more important? The front wings or the tail wings, right? Probably the tail wings. I used to say, which is more important, the right wing or the left wing when you're flying, because they both matter a lot when you're up in the air. But even without the tail wing, exercise maybe play a smaller role. Diet is a huge one. If you run on the treadmill and see how many calories you burn after running 2 or 3 miles, you'll see it's not that much. It's one Snickers bar basically. So diet is a key, but diet and exercise are both important. So the people who I find have success are the ones who exercise and watch their diets. Some people will do great with diet part, but they don't want to do exercise and they slow down and they plateau. Some people will do great with the exercise, but they hate the diet part and then they plateau. So it's one of those things where you try to figure out, okay, let's look at the big picture and say everything's important. So should I weigh myself every day, doctor? Well, that just depends again, because some people weigh themselves. I have one guy who weighs themselves every single day. And I said, well, why do you do that? He said, I like data. He's an engineer. He likes data. He wants all the points. I said, does it stress you out when you gain a pound or two, after you work out, for instance? No, doc, I know it's a trend. I know I'm just looking at the overall trend. It never stresses me out. I said, okay, cool. That's fine. Weigh yourself every day. Other people, I can guarantee, weigh themselves 5 times a day and they're stressed out and tense and they're wondering why they're not losing weight faster. And it really causes this stress response. And I'm convinced that stress is the biggest hindrance. That is the elephant in the room. If you're worried about the weight so much, rather than looking at metabolic health or how you're feeling, that's a huge, huge factor. So it just depends. And I think this is knowing yourself. If it stresses you out, don't weigh yourself as frequently, right? Because for me, Tro and I have had this discussion. At least initially, I like to look at the continuous glucose monitor because that changes very quickly. Also, insulin levels, and there's other factors, ketones. There's other things we can look at to say, hey, you're getting metabolically healthier, even if you're not seeing it on the scale. Because an important point is, Dr. O'Mara's data is showing, and if you think about a hibernating bear, when the bear wants to hibernate, what does it do? It gets fatter and fatter. What does it do? It inhibits muscle mass, right? So visceral fat is inhibiting muscle mass. Why? The more muscle mass you have, the shorter time you can hibernate because you're burning more energy. If you get rid of your muscle and you have a ton of fat, you can hibernate a long time. So what we're finding is when people initially lose weight, especially if they have a lot of visceral adipose tissue, their weight may not change much, but their inches are changing dramatically, like that example I gave you. So this is something I learned in the last 6 months is that, wow, some people will lose inches, their clothes are loose, but they don't see it on the scale. So if we're using the scale as our marker, it's going to cause way more stress than it's worth. And that makes people give up before they should. So what doesn't work? This is my toughest patient, right? If I have a menopausal, premenopausal, real estate agent, stressed out, trying to make sales, doesn't have time for herself, doesn't have time to prepare food, kids are screaming in the background, she's late for every appointment. While we're having our appointment, she's texting, go, hold on, doc, just give me, hold on, I'll be right with you. You can sense the stress, right? When you see that stress level and the intensity, gosh, sometimes it's just not the right season. It's just too much stress and trying to figure out, okay, how do I manage this? I'm trying to clean at home. Oh, can your husband help? Or can your friends help? What can we do to make this situation better? Because we have to knock a couple of these things off. Can't knock the kids off, I don't think, but you can help, just, getting them into school. And this is another thing right now, especially the COVID weight gain. A lot of that is associated with stress and just grabbing food for comfort. When you're stressed, tense, you don't have anything else that you can do. So I think this is really important. And looking at the scale 20 times a day, these kind of things just really make it a slow, hard, difficult process. So, this was from Airplane. It was like, okay, I picked the wrong week to quit smoking, drinking, all these things. But for us, we pick the wrong week sometimes to quit donuts because some people will see this and they get stressed out because if I could just have one donut, I feel better. But what we're finding in the low carb diet is a lot of times people feel like they don't need this anymore because their stress hormones drop. They're even, like you saw in those continuous glucose monitors. When we see that, I could see people coming back saying, yeah, everyone's eating donuts. I really didn't care. It didn't have that draw. Or you see it for what it is. And I think Rob Sivis, said, hey, Brian, what's your favorite donut? And I said, glazed. And he says, what happens if you have that donut, you've been waiting all day to have it, and you drop it and it falls in a pile of dog manure, right? Dog poop. Would you pick it up and eat it? Right? So of course not. So us, when you see it for what it is, you say, gosh, this is gonna make me feel bad. My energy is gonna drop. It's not worth it anymore. It's not the draw that it used to have. Saturday morning cartoons, all those kind of things, those emotional draws we have. Joe Niflin's great talking about this too. There's so many great people in this community really putting the pieces together, and that's helping us clinically. So what seems to work? Patience. Patience. Patience is the most important thing, I think, right? And then after that, the next important thing is patience. Next thing after that is patience again. So being patient, like, being the tourist, saying, okay, I'm just going to keep going. I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to give up when I gain a pound. I'm not going to give up because I had a bad weekend. And then next is perseverance, which I think is the same thing. Just keep moving, keep going forward, saying, okay, things aren't going the way they should, but I'm going to keep taking that next step. And I could tell you story after story. I have a guy who's lost over 200 pounds. He couldn't even weigh himself to start. He was on low carb for 6 months before he could get to the point where he can weigh himself on a 400-pound scale. So now he's in the 200s, and you think, wow, this is crazy. But it was one step at a time. He logged his steps, kept going, cut his carbs, kept moving, kept stepping, and had a little fall here, got back on the horse, kept going. So this is really, really critical. I think this is one thing that if I can hammer home is this: patience, 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 perseverance. So what seems to work? Stress reduction. My greatest patient right now, she's lost weight every week since July. She cut her stress down, right? So I can look at who's had success and I can say, okay, let's try to extrapolate that to ourselves, right? Stress reduction, huge deal. Because if you're a stress eater, boom, you're going to stress eat. And this is the other thing. People say, well, should I have carbs sometime or not? Well, here's the problem. If you're the person who could have one cookie and then not have a cookie for a month, probably can get away with it. But some people have one cookie and then they go crazy for a month, or they take a week vacation. I've had people totally reverse. Like the husband was totally into this, working out every day, doing great. Wife is struggling a little bit, trying to get on board. They go on vacation. They come back and they switch places. She's working out every day, watching her carbs, feeling great now because she said, I felt so terrible on vacation. I feel better now. And then the husband was saying, well, once I got back, I was too stressed at work. I had too many things going on. It's hard to get back into the routine. So I think really it's key to stay as focused as you can and then realize when you're feeling well and when you're not. That's where journaling comes in. It's very helpful. So having family support, because having couples where one says, let's go get donuts, and the other one says, no, not today. Then the other says, oh, okay, darn it. But or having meals made at home, or prepping, or all these other things that are so critical. Family support, stress. Two biggest reasons for failure: planning ahead, preparing meals, saying, hey, I'm busy, I'm crazy, like the real estate lady I told you about. Prepare your meals on Sunday. Whenever you have a break, prepare, barbecue, get all your stuff ready for the week, and so you have it. So you don't have to go out to fast food. You don't have to go out to dinner. You can do it at home. Community. We're building community here. We have Zoom meetings, group walks where we all get together. And so we have some people who are just starting their journey and they may go slower, and we put them at the back end and I'll walk with them. And then we have some faster people at the beginning. My guy who's lost 200 pounds, he's at the very front all the time, right? Because he's in good shape now. He's been really working hard. So accountability, having someone who goes, oh yeah, well, the continuous glucose monitor, that's accountability. There's no better accountability, in my opinion, because that really forces the issue, because there's no denying when you see a sugar spike. So this is helpful. Consistent exercise, no doubt about it. That is a huge factor, because as you put muscle mass on, you become more insulin sensitive. As you become more insulin sensitive, you get your insulin levels lower. All these things, keeping your sugars stable and flat, emotional eating, all these things get better once we stabilize. Get adequate sleep. Poor sleep will spike sugars. We see it on the continuous glucose monitor. Also increases stress, which again, going back to the top, is our biggest reason for failure. So adequate sleep is key. I'm working on that myself now. I've been years of sleep deprivation. Now I'm trying to get back on track. It's hard to do, actually, because your body just naturally wakes up. I wake up without the alarm trying to sleep, and I just can't, right? I'm working on it. Cutting alcohol. I'll tell you, I've done studies on this. Alcohol is a bummer because it does increase insulin levels. It decreases our metabolic rate, and it causes increased visceral fat. So you can overcome that. I'll talk a little bit more about that with exercise, but it is a tough one. Limiting dairy and nuts. My lady who's doing well, she cut out alcohol, she cut out dairy, nuts, and you just see her weight drop every week. So it's hard to do. So some of us, they say, well, should I quit dairy and nuts? Well, it just depends. it estimates say that 70% of us, 60 to 70% of us are sensitive to dairy. Yet we really, really like dairy. So it's one of those darn things. Nuts, I could tell you macadamia nuts have been my downfall. So I don't have them in my house. I love them and I will eat them. Unsalted, I won't. Salted, will. So it's really figuring out yourself and what works. And also what your goals are. If you're only 5 pounds away, maybe you say, I'll cut the nuts so I get down, a little bit. Trust the process. Trust the process. Just say, okay, I'm going to take one step at a time. I'm not going to stress every detail. Visualize my outcomes. I'm going to be positive. I'm going to keep doing this and realize it's not a sprint. It's a marathon, right? You're not going to try to run this marathon as fast as you can. So again, here we go. Alcohol. Don't hate the messenger here. I'm just showing what it says. And I didn't experiment myself and gained weight drinking alcohol for a week during Christmas, and had to take it off. But the good news is I fasted for 2 days and my weight normalized back to 7.8 pounds of weight loss, because high insulin level, I'm insulin resistant. I know I'm the person who can't do it. So again, it depends, but very few people can get away with it if you're trying to get metabolically healthier. Not ever, but I'm saying in excess every day or every 4 days a week or something like that. So the more we can cut back, the better. And I think that's where it just depends comes along, because if you're drinking every day, if we can drink every other day, we're going to start that way. And then we'll go to every third day maybe. And then we kind of realize, and some people just quit. And that's one of the big things we realized. Low Carb MD, we've talked about that on the podcast. Several people quit drugs, alcohol, pornography, things like that you wouldn't think are associated, but they are, because they're all stress reducing techniques that people have. Improvement in female sexual function on a low carb, low calorie ketogenic diet, psychological well-being, quality of life, all these things get better. So exercise and fasting, calories in versus calorie out. So this is one that I thought was interesting, because my patients who seem to exercise do better. So I started researching the difference again between visceral fat and subcutaneous fat. So exercising muscle releases interleukin 6, interleukin 10. What does that do? It goes to the liver, says release some of the sugar. That's why we see that sugar spike. Also, we'll go to the fat store and say release some fat, because we don't want to store it in energy when the muscles are demanding it, especially with a Ben Bikikyo type workout, high intensity or interval training. So it will cause release of fat tissue. So people say, well, doctor, if that's true, why don't you just give us interleukin 6? Well, interleukin 6 chronically is an inflammatory. It causes inflammation. So if I give you a bunch of interleukin 6, you release fat, you don't burn it. What do? Put it back in your fat source. You're just cycling it back to where it was and causing an inflammation. So it's not a very good plan. But blocking interleukin 6, this is the calories in, calories out, right? So they took people and they put them on a 12-week exercise program with cycling, and half the people, they gave them an interleukin 6 blocker, right? So interleukin 6 blocker, the interesting thing is that it blocks you from getting to your fat store. So these people, their LDL cholesterol went crazy and they didn't lose visceral fat, even though they did the same amount of exercise. So they were burning the same amount of calories, but this tells you that it's not about calories in and calories out. There's hormonal activation also that really play a role. So again, exercise decreases the fatty liver, triglycerides store in the liver and all that kind of stuff, and ketones got better. This is a huge one. I think this is a huge take home also, self-compassion. So when we go off the rails, right? That's the thing, is when we go off the rails, that's a problem, trying to get back on the rails. Because what happens, a lot of us who struggle with weight, once we eat something, we're a bad person, we can't do anything right, you're a loser, all these bad things. And there's so much negative. There's thousands of times a day we're giving negative self-talk. Look at you, the pants are too tight, you didn't do enough, you're not working out enough, you're doing terrible stuff at home, whatever, all those things. So we need to self-compassion, I think, of a caddy, for a golfer, because the caddy will say, okay, look, you're going to hit this club, you're going to hit it into the wind, you're going to move your foot a little bit, right? And the golfer gets up there and hits it right into the water. The caddy doesn't say, you idiot, you blew it, you're a moron. He says, hey, you know what? You almost had it. Next time we're going to change the club a little bit. We're going to change your stance. My problem on the grip. We got you. We're going to get this better. So I think that's a huge thing, is not just wallowing in your self-pity, but being able to say, okay, look, what did you learn from that experience? So if you go to grandma's house and she bakes cookies every time, well, what can I do different? Okay, I could tell her before I go, maybe you can make a different type of cookie. Make it do low carb. Let's do something different. Let's go for a walk instead. So thinking in advance, and this is the one thing my patients with success, they think in advance. They say, yeah, I'm going to this place. It's not going to be a good situation. So I have people who are taking snacks with them that are low carb. Or they're taking beef jerky that's low carb. They're planning ahead. They're bringing dessert that's fruit, berries and cream, things like that, rather than having 5 pieces of cake. So again, self-compassion is not giving yourself permission to do it all the time, but when you do, learn something from it and move forward, saying, okay, I won't make that mistake next year when this men's retreat comes up or whatever it is. Because we all go off the rails at some point. So the idea is not to go off the rails. So much you have to stop here. Don't keep going for, till you get to Chicago or New York or something like that. So it's getting back on the rails that's a hard time, right? So give yourself a little bit of a break. Like have some this self-compassion. Here's the great thing. Keep a journal, because when you're doing well, we're on all cylinders and feeling great. All of us have been there where you're working on it and you think, I'm always going to do this. And then 2 weeks later, you're sitting on the couch again, right? So think about your mood, productivity at work, relationships, all those kind of things, and write it down. Say, and count your blessings too. That's another one that lowers stress hormones, right? If you're upset and bitter with the world, it's not a good combination. So keep a journal, see how you're feeling. And focus on these things, because when you go off the rails, you'll be able to go back and say, yeah, 3 weeks ago, I felt great. And look at me, my attitude was positive. I wasn't depressed. I wasn't anxious all the time. And now I'm feeling those things. So the big thing is a lot of people feel like when they blow it for the weekend, they say, okay, now I have to pay the price. Now I have to torture my body. I'm not going to eat. I'm going to work out 4 hours today and I'm going to, blow out my knees and everything because I deserve that. No, have fun, enjoy it if you're going to. Try not to as much as possible. But if you do, okay, I'm back on track Monday and I'm going to do it because I deserve it, because I deserve to feel better. I deserve to get my energy better, and I deserve to have a positive outlook and have less stress, right? So get back on your sleep, get back on as quickly as you can. You're not a bad person just because you had a cookie or a donut or whatever, and be honest with people. Say, hey, look, when we're in group meetings, all the time I'll ask them, I know they're struggling, and I'll say, how come you didn't share that with last night at our group meeting? And they'll say, well, everyone else has their act together except me. And then the next person says, everyone has their act together except me. And the next person says the same. So really, once one person says that, and I think being real is important, because you say, yeah, I'm struggling with this, me too. And then 10 people will jump out of the woodwork and you don't feel alone. Being isolated and alone is one of the worst, as we all know, is a horrible, horrible thing. So being able to have someone to give us compassion and to uplift us, because if your friend blew it, you would say, oh man, it's okay, we'll get him next time, don't worry, you lost the game. But for us, we're the biggest loser when we lose. So I think, if you think about it, the self-compassion is like going into a football game and you have one quarterback here who says, oh, they beat us every time, we can never win, they're the best team and we don't have a chance. Or you take this quarterback who says, hey, you know what, they beat us last time, but I saw some tendencies, we can do some things, we'll make some changes, I know another guy on our team that can catch the ball better, let's make some changes and win the game. Who are you going to take to the game, right? So for ourselves, we have to bring that person who says, you can do this, you got it. Okay, you have a little loose skin, but next week it'll be better. Your weight's going to be down a little bit. You're going to be a little bit stronger. You're going to be a little bit faster. You won't be in last place forever. So let those things motivate you and not make you give up. Again, don't make yourself pay, because it's going to look like this for a lot of us. We look, and some people, it's like going to the stars, how far we have to go, but it's one step at a time. Just one step at a time, keep going. You may have to rest. It's okay. Enjoy the journey. Take a look, smell the roses, listen to the birds. It's okay, right? Because you can't run to the top of the hill and go, okay, I'm here. Now I can go back to do what I was doing, because that's going to put you back in the same disaster, the yo-yo plan that we've been on our entire lives. Because what you did before wasn't working, right? So for most of us, this is what our road looks like, right? It's not that straight road at the beginning. It's going to go back and forth and wander a little, but that's okay. Just stay on the road. You're going to get there. It's just going to take you a little bit longer, right? It's nice if it's a straight road, but sometimes you got to just go with it, right? This guy, I love this guy, Cliff Young. He's an Aussie, so Paul will like this guy. He shows up to run this crazy marathon, right? He grew up on his family farm. It was 2,000 acres. He had 2,000 sheep. They couldn't afford a horse because they were super cheap. I mean, they were poor. They were cheap too, probably because they were poor. So at 61 years of age, he said, I think I can run the Sydney to Melbourne marathon, ultra marathon. It's 544 miles. Yeah, big deal, right? So he shows up in overall and work boots without his dentures, because he said it would chatter too much when he was running. And the guy starts running. And he was, at the end of the first day, this guy had a weird shuffle, and it was just like, these guys that he was running against were trained by Nike, and they were having all the respiratory function tests and running and lifting and preparing. 23-year-old kids. He's 61 years old, right? He shows up in boots and Levi's. And the end of the first day, they're laughing, like, what are you doing here? He was dead last, but he didn't stop. Everyone else kept, taking sleep breaks for 6 hours. He kept running and kept running and kept running. And at the end, after 5 days of running, he won the race by 10 hours, right? And all the other guys couldn't believe it. So it's like the tortoise and the hare, right? He was the tortoise, but he just kept going. He didn't give up. He just kept moving forward. And so a lot of us in our low carb journey at the beginning, they're laughing at us because they think you're Cliff Young. They think you're the person who doesn't know what they're doing. Everyone else is doing better. Everyone else is losing more weight than you to start with, but stay the course, right? Because he imagined that he was chasing the sheep before the storm. They said, why'd you go? Why'd you keep going? Why'd you not stop? And he said, because the sheep. I imagined I was saving my sheep. And so he had something that drove him forward. So for us, it may be our grandkids. It may be not being the last guy in the race. It may be whatever motivates us, but keeping that positivity. He wasn't aware there was a $10,000 prize too. So at the end, he goes, oh, there's a prize. Okay, give it to the next 5 guys who all broke the previous world record, by the way, but they were 10 hours behind him. But he gave them the money because it wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the final destination. He wanted to prove he could do it. So he just kept going. So this is something like he's a huge story for us, really of this whole patience, perseverance. So sometimes we just need someone to point us the right way. There's a lot of great people out there, a lot of great docs, a lot of great nutritionists out there now who get in and say, okay, here's the road you're going to take. It's going to be a long road for some of us, and some of us it may be a shorter road, but having community, having someone on your side makes a huge difference. So like Rocky, you get up, don't stay down, you bum. And then when you get to the summit, you don't care about the pain, right? You just kind of get there. So I'm hoping that's where we all end up at some point, the best version of us we can be. We're not all going to have 6-pack abs. We're not all going to be Ted Naiman or Sean Baker, but we can be the best version of ourselves. So here's life's best medicine. Eat real food, stay away from processed foods, empty calories, that kind of stuff. Get enough sleep and rest, really critical. Exercise regularly. And a lot of us, unfortunately, we're sacrificing sleep to get exercise or exercise to get sleep. So it's figuring out how to get that balance, maybe changing up things, maybe watching less TV or exercising while you're watching TV. If you have to watch TV, turn off the news. That's good for a lot of different reasons. So don't smoke or drink alcohol to excess. Control your stress level and have good social support. Find out what you enjoy. Count your blessings. Think positive. Be kind to others. It's going back to finding what you enjoy. I have a lady, she all of a sudden started losing weight like crazy when she was struggling before. And I said, what'd you do? That's when I took up knitting again. I said, knitting? How many calories are you burning knitting? She said, no, I sat there for an hour and I just tune out the world, right? For some of us, it may be prayer, it may be yoga, it may be putting puzzles together. Find your peace. Find what you enjoy. That is key. That's a really important thing. Find your happy place. Like I said, church, yoga, collecting rocks. I don't care what it is. Keep your train as empty as possible. My other talks, I talk about filling up the train. The more full your storage units or your train is, the more insulin you have to hire to shove more stuff in there. So we try to empty that train out by watching our carbs, exercising, staying active, those kind of things. Never lose hope. Trust the process. Keep taking one step at a time. Don't get down on yourself. Say you should lose 10 pounds this week instead of 2. Trust the process and trust yourself. Trust the people who are helping you. Reach out. Listen to lectures like this. So, thank you for listening. I appreciate it. And these are some of my references. And thank you. This is a great conference. I'm really honored to be a part of it. And I hope this helps you just clinically to think about, okay, where do I go from here? What happens when I do go off the rails? Not everyone's perfect. So give yourself some grace. I think this self-compassion thing is a huge deal. And just enjoy the process. Have a great day. Thank you for listening. I appreciate that.
Another great talk. So much to take in really from a talk like that. First of all, let's talk about insulin resistance. And I think he quoted that those with insulin resistance were 6.7 times more likely to have a heart attack.
Yes, it just shows how important serum insulin is as a measure. And as you always say, it's one that we don't measure often enough.
I wonder why. Why is that? It's strange, isn't it? If I go to a doctor and ask for serum insulin, they look at me as if I'm sort of from another planet, and yet it's so much more sensitive than blood glucose, because as we know, by the time the blood glucose is abnormal, you're way gone. It's much more sensitive as an early indicator that you're getting into trouble and you're developing insulin resistance. So I think serum insulin should be part of the sort of it should be a compulsory part of basic blood screening.
I think it comes down to ignorance, because we know it's a very good measure and it's very easy to test. There's no reason why we ought not be doing it, except for the fact that we don't know how important it is.
Now, we also mentioned waist circumference. I know that's one of your pet topics. And
Yes.
tell us how you measure waist circumference.
Well, as you know, that if you have what we call a pendulous abdomen, whereas rather than being, a gentle protuberant curve, you actually end up with an overhang, which is very common. Then the traditional methods which are described to measure waist circumference become a lot more difficult. Whether we wrap the tape measure around the belly button, the umbilicus, or do we do it at the point between the lower rib and the iliac crest, the hip bone. So what I've actually found is that if you lie on your back when you measure abdominal circumference, then this totally removes any of the effects of gravity. And the belly button is always at the right level. Then you just put the tape measure exactly around the belly button. It leads to very, very reproducible measurements. And I think this should be a standard of care in everybody to, from now on, I always measure my abdominal circumferences lying on the back, what we call supine. And I think that's a bit of a pro tip for any other doctors out there who manage patients for weight loss.
Great idea. A couple of other points you made is be kind to yourself and be compassionate when your patients go off the rails, as they inevitably do in these circumstances. Show compassion. Don't criticise.
Well, I think that's the whole thing, because the existing paradigm of obesity is one of blaming the patients. It's one of guilt and it's one of shame. It's one of you being greedy and you being lazy. And we know that is not true. And I mean, so first of all, for the patients need to be educated that they're not to blame. If they've followed bad advice, they're not the ones at fault. Give themselves a leave pass. And understand too that the eating habits have built up over decades, over their whole life. And it's not just a matter of flicking a switch and you're going to be perfect on a new diet. There will be ups and there will be downs. And I think for medical practitioners too, they need to appreciate this, that patients are not machines, patients are not robots, that we're all human, and that if we do have any deviations, that's okay. Dr. Unwin talks about this. Brian Lenski is very good talking about this. We need to appreciate the humanity in our patients and give them a leave pass once in a while. And if we can show that kind of compassion, the results are going to be better at the end of the day.
And finally, I can't believe that an American was talking about Cliff Young, who's one of our local heroes here. Who it's an amazing story, the Cliff Young story. They've actually made a movie out of it, I think. But I'm not sure that we would really recommend no sleep for 5 days, would we?
No, that probably goes against the grain. Also, I'm not sure that. Given Brian's emphasis on the importance of sleep there too, I think he was probably, putting it to one side. But yeah, good on him. So Cliff Young, and as you know, one of the other guys, Paddy Farmer. Pat Farmer, another great marathoner of Australian history. But thanks, Brian, for throwing that in. Appreciate it.